Hey everyone, Tim Ard here. Just wanted to talk to you a few minutes. Coming on to Christmas season, the end of the year coming up here, and we're kind of back home this week and probably next week also. I think our next adventure on the road is going to be the first week of January. We're trying to get things kind of together. We got family coming over and all of that, and I was kind of going through some different things and came across something that I haven't used in several years, and that was a little rock. I used to tell a story, and I hope I still remember it all, but it came about this time of year several years ago. A couple friends had told me about they had gotten some funds for Christmas, and they were really into squirrel hunting, and they had received enough to maybe go buy up some new equipment. And so they pooled their resources and decided they would go see what they could find. Well, they went up to Jasper, Georgia, up to, at that time, the bargain barn, and looked through the shelves and the cabinets and asked if there was anything new for squirrels. And the gentleman there behind the counter said, well, I don't really have anything new, but I just got a new catalog in if you want to take a look at it. They said, well, we came across some funds for Christmas and we've got a little bit to spend, so we just wanted to see what was new out there. So anyhow, they started thumbing through this catalog, and they came across almost a full page spread. It talked about squirrel cannons now available. And they were about $300 a piece, and they had kind of pooled their money, had about $600, and so they said, can we get a couple of these things? He said, well, I don't know. I'll have to order them in. I don't really have anything in stock. And they said, well, we've got a few more weeks of squirrel season, and it goes on till about February, end of February up here. Said if you can get them in pretty quick, though, we'd still be able to check them out this time this year. And so he said, well, I can do it. So he called and placed the order, said they'd be coming, and the two guys left. And they waited a couple weeks, never did hear anything. They called back and said, did our cannons come in? He said, let me check. And he called and he said, oh, they're about to send them out. Well, this was rocking on now to about the middle of January. He said, well, we've got just a few weeks. We'd like to really use them. And he said, let me check again. So about a week later, he called them, said, well, they came in, and they had about 2 weeks before the end of the season. And they had already located a pretty decent spot to go on this property. So they got everything together and packed up with their new shotguns. And these things were like 410s with long barrels and a special squirrel shot. And so they headed out to squirrel camp. I mean, they were into it big time. Anyhow, they got to their spot, and big oak tree, squirrels everywhere playing in the top. They could hear them, and naturally they were there before daylight. They waited till the sun came up, and more or less one on one side of the tree, one on the other. There was just squirrels climbing everywhere, and they just opened up. Bam, 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 bam. They just shot like crazy. And after going through about a full round of shells, they said, wow, this is something else. I thought these things would do much better than that. And the other one looked at the other and said, yeah, we've gone through about a half a box of shells and hadn't hit a single squirrel yet. Said, what are we doing wrong? These things are supposed to be the finest, newest equipment that's out there. They said, I don't know. Let's sit here and think about it a minute. So they sat there and was kind of pondering the whole situation. And one of them looked up and said, who's that coming up our trail? And they look up, a young fella's walking up the path there, had a belt going around his waist, and the guys looked and said, man, I can't believe that. Look at his belt going around there. Said, it looks like a hula skirt. Said, he's got all kinds of squirrels there he's got. Young fella got up a little bit closer, and they asked him and said, son, you been hunting all morning? He said, yeah, just since daylight, hadn't been just a few minutes. He said, you got all of those squirrels since then? He said, yes, sir. He said, yeah, they're really around this morning. He said, I've done pretty good, hadn't I? And he said, what kind of gun do you use? I don't use a gun. He said, you don't use a gun? He said, no, sir. He said, I just use this little rock here. He said, I've had it for several years. Says it does a pretty good job. There's really no reason that I need a gun. He said, son, you mean to tell me you got all of those squirrels with that one rock? And he said, yes, sir. Yes, sir. It works pretty good. My daddy gave it to me. I got to see this. He said, that squirrel up there. He said, see if you can get him. Young fella looks at that squirrel. He said, that's a big one. He said, I'll try, sir. He threw that rock up and he caught it. Wham! Hit that squirrel right between the eyes. It come out of the tree. It fell on the ground. He went over, picked it up. He tucked that tail underneath his belt there, and he said, man, this is a big one. He said, how many of these y'all got? And he said, well, we don't want to talk about that. He said, but I can't believe you got all of those squirrels with that rock. And he's reaching down, picking up his rock, kind of polishing it and cleaning it. He said, yes, sir. He said, does a good job, doesn't it? He said, son, he said, I can't believe. He said, on top of that, he said, I see you threw it left-handed. You left-handed? He said, no, sir. He said, I'm not left-handed. He said, son, I saw you throw left-handed. He said, you're right-handed? He said, yes, sir. He said, well, why don't you throw with your right? He said, well, I can't. He said, what you mean you can't? He said, my daddy told me not to. He said, son, he says, again, don't throw with your right hand. He said, well, son, why doesn't your daddy want you to throw with your right hand? He said, well, he says, I tear them up too bad. You know, I heard that story and kind of converted a little bit to my guys, but basically, you know, there's a lot of times that we have situations like that. And this time of year, we get a lot of new stuff and we try to think through it all, but it all comes back down to the basics, doesn't it? In other words, when you really start to look at it all, rocks started a lot of work that chainsaws are now part of. So, you know, if you went back and you think about years and years ago, the Americans here in the United States would take a rock and they would crack it and make it sharp on one end, and they'd tie it to a stick, and they would chop and they would build. And they built all kinds of structures. And basically then people moved all the way from the east to the west, building those structures and gardening and ground and farming and raising cattle and all kinds of food sources. And it all started with a simple rock, didn't it? And you know, you start really thinking through it, said this whole nation started off with a basic rock. But just like that young fellow, what did he have to do with it? First of all, he had to recognize its power, be able to figure out what could be done with that rock. And then he had to practice it. And you know, in this great nation of ours, there's a lot of things that go on that people get in the receiving mode and they don't really think about taking and practicing it and working at it. And with chainsaws, that's a very important thing. You see, rocks can be just as dangerous as a chainsaw, can't they? But the thing is that in the right hands, if they're polished and they're practiced, they can be pretty sharp. They can be able to take and do the task. But it takes us to be able to practice it and to be efficient at it. And it goes back to those basics. So I hope y'all at this Christmas season and New Year's season find it the time and the effort to practice. Go back to the basics. Think about what really makes us work around here. We hope to see you along the ForestApps Road in 2022. It's kind of a milestone for me. This week I turned 65, and I've been messing with these chainsaws in one way or another for right at 40 years or better. Keep finding new ways to go back to the rocks. So thanks for dropping by. Have a good one. Good sawing.